Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Yud Zayin Zevachim 17. Today's daf yomi is dedicated for Shmir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shvuyim, Yeshua for Am Yisrael. On this Eitz Tzara, we're going to study the daf on the eve of Yom Kippur. The eve of Yom Kippur, and this is the 9th of Tishrei, and many of the ideas on the daf are related to ideas of atonement, purification. So we're going to start the second line from the top. It says the Tvul Yom. A person who is a Tvul Yom who does service is disqualified the service. The Gemara is discussing the concept that is actually the first concept that's discussed in the Talmud. Tvul Yom is a person who has immersed himself in the mikvah because he was tamei, but he's not yet tahor until the night comes. So he cannot eat the truma. The Kohen cannot eat the truma until nightfall. So how do we know that if he does the service before nightfall, he's disqualified it? We know. What's the source? So the Gemara says, the Tanya Rabbi Simai Omer, Remez l'Tvul Yom Shem Avad Chil Minai. And how do we know that if this Tvul Yom does the service, he's disqualified it? Tam Omer Kedoshim Yiyu V'lo Yechalu. It says, you shall be holy and you shall not desecrate my name. But we know that we don't need this to tell us this halacha that a Kohen cannot serve while he's tamei, because we already learned that out from a different pasuk, which we said in yesterday's daf, mivi nazru. So we had this concept, then today and give it over to another Indian. So it's to teach us that not only a person who is completely not tahor, but even a person who's partially removed some of the impediments to tahara. I mean, to say he's immersed in the mikvah, he's just waiting for nightfall. Also, if he does the service, will disqualify it. And the Gemara says, yeah, but from that pasuk of Kedoshim Yiyu, the context records actually other prohibitions, which right before we're talking about the prohibition of making a mark, a gash in yourself after a death, or pulling out your hair, which are prohibitions. So maybe somebody makes a bald spot, or somebody who destroys their hair, maybe as a sign of mourning, they get rid of the corners of their beard. So maybe those are prohibitions that relate. Maybe that's what it's referring to. If somebody does that and then serves, they've disqualified. So the Gemara says, no. We were going to say that the source is not that. Because the source it must be referring to Tvul Yom. Why? Because Tvul Yom De'im Avad B'Misa Minawan. How do we know that if a Tvul Yom, if he serves in the temple, he's going to get death from heaven? Because it says the Gamar Chil Mitruma, because we learn it from the fact that it says V'lo Yechalu, and also by Truma it says V'lo Yechalu. So the Pasal b'Truma Machil Avoda. So the one who's disqualified to eat the Truma, he's also disqualifying the service. The low Pasal b'Truma or Machil Avoda. But the one who's not disqualified to eat Truma, i.e. Korea Karcha, Mashas Pazakim, they're not disqualified to eat the Truma, so therefore they wouldn't disqualify the service. It says Rabba Amar Rabba, Lamui the cause of Rahmana, Lamui the cause of Rahmana, Tamei V'Tvul Yom Mechusar Kippurim. Why do we need the Torah to tell us all of these prohibitions, these three prohibitions? Wouldn't we have been able, since they have some relationship between them, the Tamei, the person who's ritually impure, the Tvul Yom, the one who's immersed in the mikvah and waiting for nightfall to be completely pure, the tahor, and the mechusar kippurim. Why do we need three separate verses? We should be able to learn them all out. Let's just pause for a moment. What is the mechusar kippurim? Mechusar kippurim really refers to 4 types of people, although in this case it only refers to 2. The mechusar kippurim is referring to somebody in 4 categories: the zav, zava, betzora, and yoledes. The Zav is the man who has a flow. The Zav is a woman who has an excessive flow beyond the typical nida. The Mitzora is a person who's a leper, and a Yoledes is a woman who's given birth. they're all what's called Mechusar Kippurim, that even though they've waited the amount of time, even though they've immersed in the mikvah, even though there's been nightfall, they still are not able to eat the kachim. They can't eat the sacred food until they bring a korban on the next day after the nightfall. Then they can eat the kachim, then they can enter into the temple. So the Gemara is saying, why do we need 3 psukim to tell us that these 3 people are also going to disqualify the service? Why do we need 3 separate psukim? Since these concepts are related, shouldn't we be able to learn them from each other? So the Gemara says, no, we need it by all 3. Because of Rahman Tameh, because if we're going to say this just by somebody who's Tameh that he disqualifies the service, that wouldn't be sufficient. Shekain Betame, because a Tameh person makes other people Tameh, so he's more severe. So, and Tvul Yom Mechusar Kippurim can't make other people Tameh, so they're not as severe. And B'Tvul Yom Mechusar Kippurim will also minay, and so, and also the Gemara is going to say that if it had just written by Tvul Yom, if it had just written by the person who is immersed in the mikvah and is waiting till nightfall, that wouldn't be sufficient. Why? Because if that would be the case, Shekain, because Mechusar Kippurim will also be named. Mechusar Kippurim would not have been able to derive from a Tvul Yom. Shekain Pasol B'Truma, because a Tvul Yom is disqualified to eat the Truma, whereas a Mechusar Kippurim is allowed to eat the Truma. They can't eat the Kochim, but they can eat the Truma. And by Mechusar Kippurim, and if the Torah just written Chil Avodah by Mechusar Kippurim, Tvul Yom will also be named. Tvul Yom would not have been able to be derived from there. Shekain Mechusar Maisa, because Mechusar Kippurim is missing an action, and so therefore you can't derive Tvul Yom from Mechusar Kippurim because Tvul Yom is not missing any action. So Mechusar Kippurim requires an action associated with it. This is a very powerful concept. We'll just stop for a moment. That on the eve of Yom Kippur, we're being told that to achieve the highest level of atonement, you need to have an action. It's not sufficient without an action. And then even though we could say we're sorry, we could say Chatanu Avinu Pashanu, we can mouth all the words. At the end of the day, the actions speak louder than words. So to achieve the highest level of atonement, we need action. And so therefore the Mechusar Kippurim is missing an action. And so therefore you can't derive the Tvul Yom from the Mechusar Kippurim. Boker Tov. So the Gemara says, Mechad lo asi. So you can't derive the other 2 from any one of these 3. So teisi chada mitarti, but maybe you only need 2, and you can learn one of them from the other 2. We're in the bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Aleph 17a. So Gemara says, well, b'hailo lichtov rachmana. Which one could the Torah maybe potentially have not written? Well, lichtov b'mechusar kippurim. Maybe the Torah wouldn't need to write it by mechusar kippurim. Right, where you're missing the korban, v'teisi mehanach, and then they can learn out mechusar kippurim from Tvul Yom, and also from Tameh. You can't. Why? Ma'ahanach shekem sulam b'truma. No, those other 2, the Tameh and the Tvul Yom, are disqualified to eat the truma, whereas the mechusar kippurim is able to eat the truma. El lichtov rachman b'Tvul Yom. So maybe the Torah wouldn't need to write it by Tvul Yom. And then you can learn out Tvul Yom from the other 2 categories of Tameh and Mechusar Kippurim. The my parachta, because what was your challenge to the Mechusar Kippurim? What was your challenge to why? What was your challenge that you can't learn out Tvul Yom from Mechusar Kippurim? Because Mechusar Kippurim is more severe because it's missing an action. But we could say that maybe you could learn it out from the combination of Tameh and Tvul Yom, because sof klishalei tumasan. Because this is a very interesting concept. At the end of the day, the Tumah of Mechusar Kippurim, it has diminished. Rashi says the Mechusar Kippurim, the Tumah of the Mechusar Kippurim has diminished. Sharei Erev Shimsha, the sun is set. So, therefore, maybe you can learn out that Tvul Yom is disqualified from a combination of Mechusar Kippurim and Tumah, because by Mechusar Kippurim it's Tumah is diminished. And the Gemara says no. The author of this says other position, Kosavar, or Rava is other position, that Mechusar Kippurim dezav kezav dami. That no, the Mechusar Kippurim, according to Rava, his tumah is not diminished. He's in the same exact level of tumah. Means that the Mechusar Kippurim is just waiting to bring his korban. So is his level of tumah exactly the same way it was when he started, or has it been receding now that he's gone to the mikvah and he's waited a certain amount of time? And the Gemara says that according to Rabbah, and the reason why I keep saying according to Rabbah is because there seems to be another opinion out there, which the Rambam actually doesn't rule like Rabbah, but the Mechusar Kippurim of a zav is like a zav, and also a mitzorah. And what does that mean? With respect to kodshim, that means to say that he still can, that with respect to kodshim, which is not allowed, but it's as though if he eats it, he'll chayav kares, or if he'll touch it, he'll make them tameh. And so therefore, the person who is missing, who has gone to the mikvah and had nightfall, but now he waits, but he hasn't brought the korban, still chayav kares if he eats the kodshim. But it's that's what our Gemara says. But not everybody holds like this opinion in the Gemara. And so then the question I had was on Yom Kippur. What's the essence of forgiveness on Yom Kippur? Are we being forgiven little by little throughout the day, or does the forgiveness come? I think you made a spill there, Jeff. There's a wipes there. So sorry about that. So do we say that little by little as the day goes, you're being forgiven for everything you do? Or do we say, at the end of the day, you have the total forgiveness? So obviously it's mostly a theoretical question, but let's say a person, for whatever reason, doesn't complete their Yom Kippur service. They at what point does the actual atonement be attained? And so the Gemara here is saying, no, you can't learn out Tvul Yom from Mechusar Kippurim and Tameh, because the Mechusar Kippurim is not the same as the Tvul Yom, because he's still requiring complete atonement. The Gemara says, Leima, or on top of Yud Zayin base, Leima, let's say that this idea of whether Mechusar Kippurim is like a zav, kezav dami, is Tanai. Let's say it's a Mechokas Tanaim, the Tanya. Sarfa onein. Let's say an onein or Mechusar Kippurim were the ones who were involved in burning the para aduma, burning the red heifer. Kshera, we're going to still say it's kosher, meaning to say that they're allowed to burn the red heifer. We know that the red heifer is not an actual korban, but it was kodshe bedek habayis. It was the value of the temple. It was burned on the Mount of Olives outside of Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, an onein who's typically disqualified from serving, and a Mechusar Kippurim, if they burn it, it's going to be kosher. Whereas Yosef HaBavli Omer, Joseph the Babylonian, he taught onein keshera, Mechusar Kippurim psula. He says actually the Mechusar Kippurim does disqualify. The onein is kosher, the Mechusar Kippurim is disqualified. So what are they arguing about? What's their basis? Must be Marisav or Mechusar Kippurim dezav kezav dami. That must be there. Yosef Ababli is saying that the Mechusar Kippurim of Zav is still like a zav, and therefore he disqualifies the paraduma if he burns it. Umarisav lav kezav dami. Whereas the Tanna Kama says he's not like the zav, he doesn't disqualify. The says no, kol yama kezav dami. Even the Tanna Kama here would say it's like the zav. What's the nature of the dispute? Tersiv v'chiza hatahor. That the one who is tahor sprinkles the ashes of the red heifer on the person who's trying to become tamei. Miklal shehu tamei. So since it says v'chiza hatahor. So since it says that the one who sprinkles it is tahor, but that word tahor is not necessary because we have already learned from the earlier verse, because it states earlier in that pasuk, it says ish tahor. So why does it say v'hiza tahor? It means to say even if he's just partially tahor, he'd be able to sprinkle it. Shehu tamei limit al tvul yom shekashor bepara. And it's teaching us that even if you're a tvul yom, you're partially tahor because you've gone to the mikveh that day, but you're not completely tahor, and then you're able to sprinkle the ashes. So Mar Savar. So how do we view the Tvul Yom vis-a-vis the Mechusar Kippurim here? Mar Savar Tuma de Torah Kula. So the position, the Tanakamu says it's kosher. He says that Tuma, that's partially in the whole Torah, and that's what it's referring to. This Tvul Yom in this pasuk is referring to somebody who's even like the Zav, and so therefore, even if he's just Mechusar Kippurim, he could sprinkle the ashes. Umar Savar Tuma Dahach Parasha. He says, no, just the Tuma that the Paraduma is purifying, i.e., Tumai Mace or anything similar to that. Hilkach Tvul Yom, Dinevela, V'tamei Sheretz, which are external Tumas, the Tvul Yom, a person who touched a dead body or a rodent, that the kili, that this is more lenient, that he could sprinkle the ashes while he's Tvul Yom. But also, but Kal V'chomer Mitvul Yom the mace. Of a Mechusar Kippurim, the Zav, the Chamir, but the Mechusar Kippurim of a Zav, it's more severe. Shekain Tuma Yotel of Megufo, because it's Tuma that he came from his body. That's not going to be work according to Rabbi Yosef Ababli. Okay, so now the Gemara brings us into the next topic, which is the Mechusar Begadim. Our Mishnah said that if somebody is Mechusar Begadim, he's missing garments, the Kohen who's missing garments is not going to be able to serve in the temple. And if he serves, it's disqualified. This also relates very much to Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur, we know that the Kohen Gadol has to change his garments 5 times. And before and after each time, he goes to the mikvah. And before and after he goes to the mikvah, he has to do what's called kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. That's wash his hands and legs. Total of 10 times of kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, 5 times the mikvah. And the reason why he has to keep changing his garments is because when he serves, typically speaking, the Kohen Gadol wears 8 garments, which are called the Big Day Zav because they have gold in them. But when he serves in the Holy of Holies, he wears the regular garments of the Kohen, which are 4 garments. There's only 4 garments that the Kohen wears, the Big Day Love and the white garments. So when he's serving in the temple, he doesn't wear the golden garments. When he's serving in the Holy of Holies, he doesn't wear the golden garments because that would be the expression that the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Vav says, and which Rashi on Parashas Achimos quotes, is Ein kateger nasa seneger. The prosecutor cannot become the defense attorney, and so therefore we don't want to remind, so to speak, Hashem of the sin of the golden calf. So the Gemara says that Mechusar Begadim, if the Kohen serves and he's not wearing one of these garments, he disqualifies the service. What's the source? Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu ba Mishmei de Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon. Now Amar Kra v'chagarta osam avneit Aaron uvanav. That it states that in Parashas Tetzaveh, when we're talking about Aaron and the garments of his son, they shall gird them with the belt, Aaron and his sons, and you shall dress them in their hats, and then it will be a kahuna for them for eternally. And it says Bizman shebigdeim aleim, and this is the very powerful phrase. Bizman, and the controversial phrase, Bizman shebigdeim aleim kunasim aleim, and bigdeim aleim ain't kunasim aleim. When the Kohanim are wearing their garments, then they are considered to be Kohanim. But when they're not wearing their garments, they are not going to be considered the Kohanim. So what does this phrase mean? Rabbeinu Tam took a very severe position on it. The Mordechai at the end of Gittin cites a story that Rabbeinu Tam was once washing his hands, and a non-Kohen washed his hands for him. And a Kohen washed Rabbeinu Tam's hands. So the students asked Rabbeinu Tam, how are you able to have a Kohen serve you? You're not allowed to have this Kohen serve you. So how could he wash your hands? So Rabbeinu Tam responded, well, since he's not wearing, he quoted our Gemara, when they're wearing their clothing, they're considered to be Kohanim. When they don't wear their clothing nowadays, they don't wear their clothing, they don't have the status of a Kohuna and they could serve us. But we don't paskin like that because we say that they still have their status of Kohanim today. But Rabbeinu Tam said, no, he took this literally. Literally, when they don't have their garments on them, they're not going to be considered Kohanim. So the Gemara says, back to our question, is that the source of the idea that it disqualifies? The Gemara is a different possibility. What's the other possibility? May also nafka from a different teaching. Tanya, we weren't in the Brisa. How do we know if there's a Kohen who's drunk some wine? It doesn't mean he's drunk. It means he's drunk revius of wine, that he's not allowed to do the service. Shem Avad Chil, they'll disqualify it. Tam Omer, Yayin v'Shecher al teish. Do not drink wine and alcohol. And uavdil, and it says right afterwards, uavdil bein hakodesh u'vein hachol, and to distinguish between kodesh and the chol. And the intent of the pasuk is to teach us that the service that you do while you're after you drink is considered to be chol, and so therefore avoda kshera is kodesh, and avoda after you drink is disqualified. And so those are the two possible psukim that are the source for this. Okay, we can go on a little bit, but we'll stop the recording here because this is the daf for Daf Yud Zayin.